My name is Joaquin Delgado. 7 days ago, I was a river barge captain moving grain down the Mississippi. Then the zombie outbreak hit and everything changed. The dead learned to swim, desperate survivors tried to steal my boat, and I had to choose between saving strangers or protecting my crew. I watched entire cities burn from my floating sanctuary while making impossible decisions that still haunt me. The river I trusted became a battlefield where the infected hunted in packs, and other survivors proved more dangerous than the dead. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Joaquin Delgado, and I need to tell you about the 7 days that changed everything. 7 days ago, I was captain of a commercial river barge called La Esperanza, running freight up and down the Mississippi River system like my father did, and his father before him. 3 generations of Delgados had worked these waters, and I thought I knew every danger they could throw at me. Low water levels, equipment failures, Coast Guard inspections, drunk pleasure boaters, even the occasional smuggler trying to use my route for their business. I had seen it all, or so I believed. The river business isn't glamorous work, but it's honest. We moved grain from the agricultural heartland down to New Orleans, brought manufactured goods back upstream to cities like Memphis and St. Louis. My crew consisted of 8 good people, mostly guys who had been working rivers their whole lives. There was Carlos, my first mate who could spot a sandbar in murky water from half a mile away. Tommy from Louisiana, our mechanic who could fix a diesel engine with nothing but spare parts and creative cursing. Alina, one of the few women tough enough to handle barge work, who ran our loading operations with military precision. These weren't just employees, they were family, and I trusted each of them with my life on a regular basis. La Esperanza herself was a beauty, even if she didn't look like much to outsiders. 180 feet of reinforced steel hull, powered by twin diesel engines that could push us upstream against strong current, or let us drift downstream with a full load of cargo. I had installed solar panels on the wheelhouse roof 3 years back, not because I cared about being green, but because backup power meant independence. My grandfather always told me that the river could trap you for weeks without warning, cut you off from the outside world when storms hit or equipment failed. He taught me to keep extra fuel, extra food, spare parts for everything important. People called it paranoia, but river families know better. We call it survival. The morning of October 15th started like any other Tuesday. We were loaded with grain containers bound for a facility just outside New Orleans, making good time downstream, with the current helping us along. The weather was clear, water levels were decent for the season, and my crew was in good spirits. Carlos was telling stories about his weekend fishing trip, Tommy was complaining about his ex-wife's lawyer again, and Alina was reviewing our delivery schedule for the next few days. Just another day on America's busiest commercial waterway. I should have noticed the signs earlier. The river traffic was unusually light that morning, now that I think back on it. Normally, we would pass at least a dozen other commercial vessels on a typical run between Memphis and Vicksburg, not counting the recreational boats and fishing charters. But that morning, the Mississippi felt almost empty. Carlos mentioned it around 10 o'clock, said it reminded him of the days right before Hurricane Katrina, when everyone with sense had already headed for safe harbor. I told him he was imagining things, that we were just running ahead of the usual schedule. The radio chatter was normal at first. Weather reports, traffic updates, the usual banter between captains who had known each other for years. Captain Williams on the Nancy Marie was about 12 miles ahead of us, hauling petroleum products upstream. Captain Rodriguez was bringing a load of containers down from St. Louis, still 2 days behind us. We checked in with each other every few hours, sharing information about water conditions, weather changes, anything that might affect navigation. It was a tradition that went back decades, river captains looking out for each other because we all knew how quickly things could go wrong out here. Around noon, we stopped at a small loading dock near Helena, Arkansas to take on additional grain containers. It was a routine stop, the kind we made dozens of times each year. The dock workers were efficient, using their cranes to load our cargo while my crew secured everything properly. I was in the wheelhouse reviewing our updated weight distribution when Carlos came up to tell me about some kind of commotion at the truck stop about half a mile inland. He said there were a lot of people running around, maybe some kind of accident or fight. We could see emergency vehicle lights flashing through the trees, but that wasn't unusual for a truck stop on a busy highway. That's when the emergency broadcast started. It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon when every radio frequency started crackling with priority alerts. The National Weather Service, Coast Guard, even the commercial channels were broadcasting emergency messages. At first, the reports were confusing and contradictory. Civil unrest in major cities, hospitals overwhelmed with some kind of illness, communications being disrupted across multiple states. I thought maybe it was another terrorist attack like 9/11, or perhaps a major chemical spill that was affecting air quality. The authorities were telling everyone to stay indoors, avoid contact with infected individuals, and wait for further instructions. The Coast Guard came on the emergency frequency and ordered all river traffic to anchor in place immediately. No exceptions, no questions, just stop where you were and wait for further orders. In 20 years of running this river, I had never heard a blanket order like that. Even during the worst hurricanes, they would give you options, tell you where to find safe harbor. This was different. This felt like panic from people who were supposed to stay calm no matter what happened. My crew gathered in the galley to listen to the radio reports. The news was getting worse by the hour. Atlanta was reporting massive casualties from some kind of outbreak. Chicago had declared martial law. New Orleans, our destination, had quarantined the entire French Quarter and was turning away all incoming traffic. The reporters kept using words like aggressive behavior and unprovoked attacks and spread through bodily fluids. It sounded like some kind of disease, but diseases don't usually cause civil unrest on this scale. That's when we saw them. Elena was the first to spot the people running along the shoreline. At first glance, they looked like anyone else, maybe folks evacuating from whatever emergency was happening inland. But something about the way they moved was wrong. They were running too fast, not like people fleeing in panic but like predators chasing prey. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like they had forgotten how human bodies were supposed to work. Carlos joked that they looked like people rushing for Black Friday sales, all elbows and desperation. Nobody was laughing when we heard the screaming. The screaming was coming from the direction of the truck stop, and it wasn't the kind of yelling you hear during a normal emergency. These were sounds of pure terror, the kind that makes your blood freeze even when you don't know what's causing them. Tommy grabbed a pair of binoculars and climbed up to get a better view. When he came back down, his face was pale and he wasn't making jokes anymore. He said the truck stop was chaos, people attacking each other with no warning, no apparent reason. He said it looked like everyone had gone completely insane at the same time. I made the decision to cut our stop short and get back on the river. Whatever was happening on shore, we were safer in deep water where we had room to maneuver. My crew was nervous, but they trusted my judgment, and we had La Esperanza loaded and underway within 30 minutes. As we pulled away from the dock, I could see smoke rising from several locations around Helena. The emergency vehicle lights were multiplying, and the radio reports were becoming more urgent with each passing hour. The sun was setting by the time we reached the area around Vicksburg, and the view from the river was like something out of a nightmare. Fires were burning on both sides of the Mississippi, not just in one or two locations, but scattered across the entire landscape as far as we could see. The usual lights from homes and businesses were flickering and going dark. Radio traffic was becoming sporadic as stations went off the air one by one. Captain Williams checked in around 8 o'clock to report that he was seeing similar conditions upstream, but his transmission was cut short by sounds that none of us wanted to think about too carefully. That night, anchored in the middle of the river with a skeleton watch rotation, I started hearing something new on the emergency frequencies. Between the official broadcasts and the panicked civilian chatter, there were these strange bursts of static that almost sounded like patterns. Not random interference, but something more deliberate, like someone was trying to communicate using a code I didn't recognize. I mentioned it to Alina during her watch shift, and she said she had noticed it too. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than just civil unrest or a disease outbreak. This felt like the collapse of everything we had taken for granted. By dawn on October 16th, the world had changed completely. Helena, Arkansas was burning. I watched through binoculars from about 2 miles downstream as groups of people swarmed anyone who tried to escape by car. But these weren't normal people anymore. They moved wrong, attacked without warning, showed no response to injury or pain. The smart ones, the survivors who still had their minds intact, were trying to reach the water. Some made it to the riverbank, but most couldn't swim well enough to reach us in the main channel. I had to make the hardest decision of my life that morning. There were maybe 20 people stranded on a partially collapsed dock, waving frantically for help. They had children with them, families who had lost everything but still had hope that someone would save them. My crew was ready to attempt a rescue. Carlos had already started calculating approach vectors, and Tommy was preparing rescue lines. Alina was organizing space in our crew quarters for additional passengers. But I had been watching the people on shore, and I had seen what happened to the rescue boats that got too close. The infected, and that's what I had started calling them in my mind, were not random in their movements. They hunted in packs, coordinated their attacks, waited for opportunities. Every time someone tried to help the stranded survivors, they were overwhelmed by infected who seemed to appear from nowhere. I watched 3 different rescue attempts fail in the span of an hour, each one ending with screams and blood in the water. I ordered my crew to pull anchor and continue downstream. It was the most difficult command I had ever given, and I could see the disappointment and anger in their faces. Alina actually argued with me, said we couldn't just abandon those people. Carlos pointed out that we had the space and supplies to save at least some of them. Tommy asked what the point was of surviving if we lost our humanity in the process. I understood their feelings because I shared them. Every instinct I had was telling me to help those people, to risk everything for the chance to save innocent lives. But I also had a responsibility to my crew, to the people who had trusted me with their safety. And I had spent enough time studying the behavior of the infected to know that approaching that dock would have been suicide for all of us. The smart play, the cold calculation that kept people alive in dangerous situations, was to keep moving. The radio reports that morning painted a picture of nationwide catastrophe. Atlanta was gone, completely overrun according to the last transmission from emergency services there. Chicago was under martial law, but even the military was struggling to maintain control. New Orleans had sealed off all access routes and was shooting anyone who tried to approach the city limits. Washington, D.C. had gone silent sometime during the night. The federal government, if it still existed, was not responding to emergency communications. Other river captains were checking in sporadically, but their reports were uniformly grim. Captain Rodriguez had abandoned his barge near Memphis after being overrun by infected, who had somehow learned to climb aboard moving vessels. Captain Johnson, downstream from us, reported that infected were appearing in the water itself, swimming with enough coordination to pose a threat to navigation. The Mississippi River, which had been our highway to safety, was becoming as dangerous as anywhere else. I started making different calculations that morning. Instead of planning for a routine delivery run, I was thinking about long-term survival. How much fuel did we have, and how far could it take us? What were our food stores, and how long could they last with a crew of 8? Where could we find safe harbor if every port was compromised? My grandfather's lessons about emergency preparedness were finally making sense, but even his paranoid stockpiling might not be enough for what we were facing. The most disturbing part was watching how quickly the infected were learning and adapting. During that first day, they had seemed like mindless predators, attacking anything that moved without strategy or coordination. But by the second day, I was seeing behavior that suggested they were developing tactics, learning from their encounters with human survivors. They were setting up ambushes at likely escape routes, working together to overwhelm defensive positions, even using basic tools to enhance their attacks. That night, anchored in a wide section of river south of Vicksburg, I gathered my crew for a serious discussion about our situation. I laid out the facts as I understood them. We were probably looking at a complete breakdown of civilization, at least in the short term. The infected were spreading rapidly and seemed to be learning new behaviors daily. Every major population center was either overrun or under siege. The river offered some protection, but it was not the safe haven we had initially believed. I gave my crew the choice to leave if they wanted to try reaching their families or finding other shelter. Carlos had relatives in Texas who might still be safe. Tommy's ex-wife lived in a rural area of Louisiana that might have escaped the worst of the outbreak. Alina had military contacts who might be organizing some kind of resistance. I would not have blamed any of them for choosing to leave, and I would have helped them reach shore safely if that's what they decided. But they all chose to stay, not because they thought La Esperanza was the safest option, but because we had become a family over the years of working together. Carlos said his relatives were probably better off without him bringing danger to their door. Tommy admitted that his ex-wife would probably shoot him on sight even before the apocalypse. Alina pointed out that military units were likely the first targets for any organized infected attacks. They were staying because we were stronger together than any of us would be alone. That decision, made in the galley of a grain barge anchored in the middle of America's greatest river, would define everything that happened over the next 5 days. We were committed to each other and to La Esperanza, for better or worse. Whatever challenges we faced, we would face them as a crew, as a family, as the last remnant of a world that was disappearing around us. The radio chatter was getting stranger that night. More of those coded transmissions in the static, almost like someone was trying to coordinate activities across a wide area. Official emergency broadcasts were becoming less frequent and more desperate in tone. The civilian channels were full of panic and misinformation, people sharing rumors and conspiracy theories about what had caused the outbreak and whether anyone was working on a solution. But there was something else I was starting to notice in the radio traffic. Patterns in the chaos, signs that some survivors were getting organized, developing networks of communication and mutual support. It was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't listening carefully, but it gave me hope that we weren't completely alone in our struggle. Somewhere out there, other people were fighting back, trying to rebuild some semblance of civilization from the ruins of the old world. As I prepared to take the night watch, leaving my crew to get what rest they could, I reflected on how much our situation had changed in just 2 days. We had gone from being commercial freight haulers to refugees, from following established shipping schedules to making up survival strategies as we went along. The skills that had made us good at river work, reading water conditions, maintaining equipment under pressure, working as a coordinated team, were proving valuable in ways I had never imagined. But I also knew that the worst was yet to come. The infected were getting smarter, more organized, more dangerous with each passing hour. Other survivors were becoming desperate, and desperate people could be just as threatening as any monster. Our supplies were limited, our fuel was finite, and we had no clear destination or long-term plan for survival. What I didn't know yet, what I would discover over the next 5 days, was that the river I had trusted with my life was about to become my greatest enemy. The morning of October 17th started with what I thought was good news. My crew had slept better than expected, the weather was holding steady, and we had made good progress downstream during the night. Carlos reported that our fuel consumption was still within acceptable parameters, and Tommy had completed his morning engine checks without finding any problems. Alina had organized our supplies and confirmed that we had enough food and water for at least 2 weeks, assuming we didn't take on any additional passengers. For a few hours that morning, I allowed myself to believe that we might actually make it through this crisis. The radio reports were still grim, but they were becoming more sporadic as stations went off the air or lost power. In a strange way, the silence was almost comforting. It meant we weren't hearing new reports of cities falling or military units being overrun. Maybe the situation was stabilizing. Maybe the authorities were getting the outbreak under control. Maybe we would be able to return to normal operations within a few weeks. I should have known better. 3 generations of river experience had taught my family that when the Mississippi gets quiet, that's when you need to worry most. We were passing through a wide section of river near the Mississippi-Arkansas border when Carlos spotted the first debris field. At first glance, it looked like the usual collection of logs, trash, and random objects that the current picks up and carries downstream. But as we got closer, I could see that this debris was different. These weren't natural materials or typical river garbage. These were personal belongings, pieces of clothing, fragments of boats and docks, the kind of debris you see after a major disaster. Alina used the binoculars to get a better look at the floating wreckage. She identified parts of at least 3 different recreational boats, several life preservers, what looked like pieces of a fishing pier, and dozens of smaller items that had probably belonged to people trying to escape by water. The debris field stretched for almost half a mile downstream, a floating graveyard of failed escape attempts. That's when Carlos spotted movement in the water that wasn't debris. At first, I refused to believe what he was telling me. Dead people don't swim. Infected people, even if they retained some basic motor functions, wouldn't have the coordination necessary to move through water with any kind of purpose. But Carlos was insistent, and he had better eyesight than anyone else on my crew. He said there were at least a dozen figures in the water, moving against the current with deliberate strokes, heading directly toward our position. I grabbed the binoculars and saw them for myself. They moved through the water like predators, not like drowning victims or people in distress. Their swimming technique was crude but effective, and they showed no signs of fatigue or fear. Most disturbing of all, they were coordinating their approach, spacing themselves out to cut off potential escape routes, working together like a pack of wolves hunting prey. I ordered emergency speed and turned La Esperanza toward deeper water in the main channel. Our twin diesels responded immediately, pushing us upstream against the current while I tried to put distance between us and the swimmers. But these infected were faster in the water than I had expected, and they seemed to understand our intentions. Instead of following directly behind us, they spread out in a pattern designed to intercept our course no matter which direction we chose. Tommy had armed himself with one of the boat hooks we used for handling cargo, and Alina had found the flare gun we kept for emergencies. Carlos was monitoring our engine temperature and fuel consumption while I focused on navigation. We were working as a team, each person handling their assigned responsibilities, but I could feel the fear building among my crew. This was something none of us had trained for or even imagined. The first infected reached our hull about 10 minutes into the chase. I could hear the sound of hands slapping against steel, the scraping of fingernails trying to find purchase on the smooth surface of our barge. They were attempting to climb aboard, and while our high freeboard made that difficult, I had seen enough infected behavior over the past 2 days to know they would figure out a solution eventually. Alina fired the first flare directly into the water near the largest concentration of swimmers. The bright magnesium flame created a temporary barrier that scattered some of them, but others simply swam around the obstacle and continued their approach. Tommy was using the boat hook to push away any infected that got too close to our loading equipment, but it was like trying to hold back a flood with a broom. That's when I discovered something that probably saved our lives. The infected were strong and coordinated, but they were also single-minded in their pursuit. When I turned La Esperanza in a sharp arc and gunned the engines to maximum power, the wash from our propellers created a powerful current that scattered the swimmers and pushed them downstream. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it bought us enough time to escape into deeper water where they couldn't follow. We spent the next hour watching our wake, making sure the infected weren't somehow keeping pace with us underwater. Carlos reported that our fuel consumption had spiked during the emergency acceleration, and Tommy was monitoring engine temperatures that had climbed into the warning range. Alina was checking our hull for any damage from the encounter, looking for signs that the infected had managed to compromise our watertight integrity. But the most important discovery came from studying their behavior during the attack. These infected weren't just mindlessly aggressive. They had demonstrated tactical thinking, coordinated movement, and adaptive problem-solving. They had spread out to cut off escape routes, maintained formation during the pursuit, and regrouped quickly after being scattered by our propeller wash. Whatever had happened to their brains, they had retained enough cognitive function to hunt as an organized pack. I started making new calculations that afternoon, recalibrating our survival strategies based on this new information. The river was no longer our sanctuary. Every mile of waterway was potentially infested with infected who could swim, coordinate attacks, and learn from their encounters with human survivors. Our speed advantage was limited by fuel consumption, and our defensive capabilities were minimal against determined boarders. More importantly, I realized that other survivors would be having similar encounters. Anyone who had tried to escape by water, thinking the rivers and lakes offered safety from the infected hordes, would be discovering the same terrible truth we had just learned. Boats would be abandoned, crews would be killed or infected, and the waterways would become as dangerous as anywhere else. The radio traffic that afternoon confirmed my fears. Captain Johnson downstream was reporting attacks on his towboat by infected swimmers near Natchez. A recreational boat operator near Baton Rouge had broadcast a desperate plea for help before his transmission was cut short by sounds that none of us wanted to interpret. Even the Coast Guard stations that were still operational were advising all civilian vessels to avoid contact with people in the water, regardless of whether they appeared to be survivors in distress. But there was another element to consider. If the infected could swim and coordinate attacks, they could also spread the outbreak to areas that had previously been protected by water barriers. Islands, coastal communities, offshore facilities, anywhere that people had thought water would keep them safe was now vulnerable. The geographic advantages that had protected human settlements for thousands of years were disappearing. Alina made an observation that evening that chilled me more than anything else we had encountered. She said the infected swimmers had shown no signs of fatigue during their pursuit, no evidence that extended time in the water was affecting their performance. Normal humans, even strong swimmers, would have shown signs of exhaustion after swimming at that intensity for 10 minutes. But these infected had maintained their pace until we escaped, suggesting they had stamina reserves far beyond normal human limits. Tommy added his own disturbing insight. He said the infected had been wearing the remains of clothing and life preservers, indicating they had been normal people when they first entered the water. They weren't some kind of aquatic mutation. They were regular humans who had retained their swimming abilities after infection. That meant any survivor who got bitten near water could potentially become part of an aquatic hunting pack within hours. I started implementing new security protocols that night. We established continuous watches with armed crew members, installed improvised early warning systems using fishing line and empty cans, and developed emergency procedures for repelling boarders. Carlos worked out fuel-efficient routes that kept us in deep water away from shore-based ambush sites. Alina organized our defensive supplies and made sure everyone knew how to use the weapons we had available. But the most important change was psychological. We had lost the sense of security that came from believing we were safe on the water. Every piece of floating debris could be hiding infected swimmers. Every mile of river could contain a deadly ambush. Every decision about navigation or stopping had to account for the possibility of coordinated attacks by infected who were learning to use the water as their hunting ground. The coded transmissions in the radio static were becoming more frequent and more complex. Alina, who had some communications training from her time in the National Guard, thought she was beginning to recognize patterns that suggested organized survivor networks. Someone out there was coordinating activities across multiple locations, sharing information about infected behavior, maybe even planning coordinated responses to the outbreak. But we were also hearing other things in the radio chatter. Reports of survivor groups turning violent, fighting each other for resources and safe territory. Stories of people being abandoned or betrayed by their own companions when supplies ran low. Evidence that the breakdown of civilization was creating dangers that had nothing to do with infected attacks and everything to do with human nature under extreme stress. I made the decision that night to start rationing our fuel more severely. Not because we were running low, but because I was beginning to understand that this crisis was going to last much longer than any of us had initially expected. The infrastructure that supported river commerce, the network of fuel depots and supply stations and repair facilities, was probably gone forever. Whatever fuel we had on board might be all we would ever have. My crew accepted the new restrictions without complaint, but I could see the worry in their faces. Carlos asked quietly whether I thought we would ever make it back to New Orleans, whether there would still be a port authority to receive our cargo delivery. Tommy wondered if our families back home even knew we were alive, if there was still a home to return to when this was over. Alina started talking about long-term survival strategies, as if she was accepting that our old lives were gone, and we needed to build new ones from whatever we could salvage. That night, anchored in a remote section of river that offered good visibility in all directions, I reflected on how much our situation had deteriorated in just one day. We had gone from thinking the water offered safety to knowing it contained deadly threats. We had discovered that the infected were far more dangerous and adaptable than anyone had realized. We had begun to accept that the world we knew was probably gone forever. But we had also learned valuable lessons about survival. We had successfully defended ourselves against a coordinated attack, developed new tactics for dealing with aquatic threats, and maintained our unity as a crew under extreme stress. Our boat was still operational, our supplies were adequate for the short term, and we had the skills and knowledge necessary to navigate whatever challenges lay ahead. What I didn't know yet, what I would discover over the next day, was that surviving the infected was only half the battle. The other half involved surviving other human beings who were becoming desperate enough to do anything for the resources we carried. And in some ways, that would prove to be even more dangerous than the undead hordes that had already cost us our faith in the safety of deep water. The Mississippi River had been my highway, my workplace, my sanctuary for most of my adult life. My family had trusted these waters for 3 generations, learned to read their moods and navigate their dangers, built our livelihood on the reliable flow of commerce between America's heartland and the Gulf of Mexico. But that river was gone now, replaced by something alien and hostile, where the dead could swim and hunt in coordinated packs, where every mile of water held the potential for deadly encounter. As I settled in for the night watch, listening to the distant sounds of a civilization tearing itself apart, I tried to prepare mentally for whatever tomorrow would bring. The infected had already demonstrated that they could adapt and learn faster than we could develop countermeasures. Other survivors were becoming increasingly desperate and potentially dangerous. Our resources were finite and irreplaceable. But there was something else I was starting to sense in the radio transmissions, in the patterns of debris and destruction we were seeing along the riverbanks, in the coordinated behavior of the infected themselves. This outbreak wasn't random or accidental. Someone or something was directing the spread of infection, coordinating the attacks, maybe even learning from each encounter between infected and survivors. And that meant we weren't just fighting for survival against mindless monsters. We were fighting a war against an enemy that was getting smarter with every battle, adapting to our tactics, learning our weaknesses, preparing for encounters we couldn't even imagine yet. The next 5 days would test every skill I had learned in 20 years of river work, every lesson my grandfather had taught me about surviving when the odds were impossible, every bond of trust and loyalty that held my crew together. Because what I was about to discover was that the infected weren't the only ones who had learned to hunt in packs. Dawn on October 18th brought a sight that changed everything I thought I understood about survival. We were approaching a section of river near the Louisiana border when Alina spotted them through the morning mist. A family stranded on what remained of a collapsed fishing pier, waving frantically at any boat that passed. There was a woman, a man, and two small children, maybe 6 and 8 years old. They had been there long enough to look desperate, but not long enough to give up hope. The pier they were trapped on was maybe 30 feet from shore, surrounded by deep water on all sides. It was the kind of situation that made perfect sense as an escape plan. Get away from the infected hordes on land, find a defensible position surrounded by water, wait for rescue, or for the crisis to pass. Except now I knew that water wasn't the barrier these people thought it was. My crew saw them at the same time I did, and their reaction was immediate. Carlos was already calculating approach angles and water depth. Tommy was preparing rescue lines and flotation devices. Alina was clearing space in our crew quarters for additional passengers. These were good people doing what good people do when they see others in distress. They wanted to help, and under normal circumstances, I would have been proud to lead a rescue operation. But I had been watching the shoreline around that pier for the past 10 minutes, and I had seen movement in the trees that didn't look like wind or wildlife. I had counted at least 15 infected positioned in concealment, waiting with the kind of patience that suggested they understood the psychology of rescue operations. This wasn't a random encounter. It was a carefully planned ambush using human bait. The infected had learned to use our humanity against us. I made the decision to attempt the rescue anyway, but with modifications that my crew didn't understand at first. Instead of approaching directly, I positioned La Esperanza upstream and used our current advantage to drift toward the pier with engines on standby. Instead of coming alongside the structure, I stopped just close enough to throw rescue lines. Instead of taking our time to ensure everyone's safety, I gave the family exactly 60 seconds to get aboard before we pulled away. The woman reached us first, and I could see immediately that she was injured. There were bite marks on her left arm that she was trying to hide with torn clothing, wounds that were already showing signs of infection. She kept thanking us for the rescue, saying they had been trapped for 2 days, begging us to help her husband and children. But I could see the fever in her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands that meant the infection was already taking hold. Her husband made it aboard with both children just as the infected sprang their ambush. They came from 3 different directions simultaneously, some emerging from the tree line on shore, others rising from concealment along the collapsed sections of the pier, and a few more surfacing from the water itself, where they had been waiting underwater for the rescue attempt. It was a coordinated attack that demonstrated planning and tactical thinking that should have been impossible for infected individuals. I gunned the engines and pulled away from the pier while Carlos and Tommy secured our new passengers. The woman was trying to help with her children, but I could see her condition deteriorating rapidly. The fever was getting worse, her coordination was becoming erratic, and she was starting to show the aggressive tendencies that marked the transition from human to infected. We had maybe an hour before she became a threat to everyone on board. The moral weight of that realization was crushing. We had saved this family from certain death, brought them aboard our sanctuary, given them hope for survival. But in doing so, we had also introduced a deadly threat into our closed environment. The woman was going to become infected whether we helped her or not, but now her transformation would happen in close quarters with people who cared about her welfare. Alina was the first to notice the bite marks, and her reaction told me she understood the implications immediately. She had military training, experience with triage situations where difficult decisions had to be made quickly. But she was also a fundamentally decent person who couldn't easily accept the idea of abandoning someone who needed help. The conflict between pragmatic survival and basic humanity was written across her face. The children were the worst part. They were too young to understand what was happening to their mother, too innocent to recognize the danger they were all in. The boy kept asking when they could go home, whether Daddy was going to be okay if the bad people were gone now. The girl just clung to her mother and cried, overwhelmed by events beyond her comprehension. They trusted us completely, believed we would keep them safe, had no idea that we might be forced to make choices that would destroy their world. Tommy pulled me aside and asked the question I had been dreading. What were we going to do when the woman turned? We couldn't restrain her without traumatizing the children, couldn't isolate her without separating a family that had already lost everything else, couldn't treat her condition because we had no medical supplies or expertise. But we also couldn't allow an infected person to remain aboard a confined vessel with a crew of 8 and 2 innocent children. I made the hardest decision of my life up to that point. I called the family together and explained the situation as gently as possible. The woman already knew what was happening to her, could feel the infection spreading through her system, understood that her time was limited. Her husband was in denial at first, insisting that the bite marks weren't that serious, that she just needed rest and medical attention. But eventually, he accepted the reality of our situation. The woman asked for one favor. She wanted to be put ashore while she was still human, while she could still make the choice to die as herself rather than as the monster she was becoming. She didn't want her children's last memory of her to be the moment she lost control and tried to attack the people who had saved them. She wanted to say goodbye while she still remembered how to love them. We found a small island about 2 miles downstream, just a patch of high ground with a few trees and some rocky shoreline. It wasn't much, but it was isolated enough that an infected person couldn't easily reach other potential victims. The woman hugged her children and told them she loved them, that they should be brave and listen to the nice people who were going to take care of them. She told her husband to find somewhere safe and build a new life, to make sure the children remembered her as she was and not as what she was becoming. I still remember watching her walk away from the shoreline as we pulled back into the main channel. She turned and waved once, and for that moment she was just a mother saying goodbye to her family, not a victim of a plague that was destroying civilization. 20 minutes later, we heard the single gunshot that meant she had found the weapon we had left with her and made the choice to end her suffering on her own terms. Her husband barely spoke for the rest of the day. The children kept asking when Mommy was coming back, and he would just hold them and say she had gone to heaven to wait for them. Alina took charge of caring for the kids, finding them clean clothes from our emergency supplies, making sure they had enough to eat, trying to create some sense of normalcy in a situation that was anything but normal. But we had learned something important from that encounter. The infected were using human psychology against us, setting traps that exploited our natural desire to help people in distress. They understood enough about human behavior to predict where survivors would go, what routes they would take, what would motivate them to take risks. This wasn't random predatory behavior. It was strategic thinking applied to hunting human prey. Carlos estimated that our rescue attempt had cost us about 3 hours and a significant amount of fuel. More importantly, it had revealed our position to any infected in the area and demonstrated that we were willing to risk ourselves for strangers. Word would spread through whatever communication network the infected were using, and future ambushes would be planned with our behavioral patterns in mind. That afternoon brought our first encounter with hostile human survivors. We were passing near a damaged marina when several armed men emerged from concealment and demanded that we come ashore to share our supplies. They claimed to represent a survivor community that was coordinating rescue efforts, but their weapons were pointed at us, and their demands sounded more like robbery than cooperation. The leader was a man in his 40s wearing military-style clothing and carrying what looked like an assault rifle. He said they had been watching us for several hours, knew we had taken on additional passengers, and could tell from our cargo configuration that we were carrying valuable supplies. He gave us a choice: voluntarily share our resources with their community, or have those resources taken by force after they disabled our vessel and eliminated any resistance. I had dealt with river pirates before, but this was different. These weren't professional criminals looking for quick profit. They were desperate people who had lost everything and decided that survival justified any action. They probably had families to feed, communities to protect, genuine needs that drove them to threaten other survivors. But their desperation made them more dangerous than any traditional criminal because they had nothing left to lose. Alina whispered that she counted at least 8 armed individuals positioned around the marina, with more probably hidden from view. Tommy pointed out that they had positioned themselves to cover all our escape routes, demonstrating tactical knowledge that suggested military or law enforcement experience. Carlos noted that our fuel situation didn't allow for extended high-speed maneuvering if we had to fight our way out of an ambush. The negotiation lasted about 20 minutes, and it taught me a lot about how quickly civilized behavior breaks down under extreme stress. These people weren't evil, they were scared. They had probably started as a legitimate survivor group trying to help each other through the crisis. But as resources became scarce and threats multiplied, they had gradually accepted more and more extreme measures to ensure their own survival. I offered to trade some of our emergency supplies for information about river conditions downstream, but they wanted everything: food, fuel, weapons, even our vessel itself. They claimed they could make better use of our resources than we could, that their community included women and children who deserved protection more than a crew of commercial workers. It was a rational argument from their perspective, but accepting it would have meant our deaths. The standoff ended when infected began emerging from the wooded areas around the marina. Apparently, our extended negotiation had attracted attention from infected scouts, who had summoned reinforcements to investigate the concentration of human voices. The armed survivors found themselves caught between the infected advancing from shore and our barge, blocking their water escape route. I made a split-second decision that probably saved lives on both sides. Instead of taking advantage of their distraction to escape, I maneuvered La Esperanza close enough for the armed survivors to jump aboard. It wasn't altruism, it was pragmatic calculation. These people had weapons and tactical skills that might be useful in defending against infected attacks, and leaving them to die would have eliminated potential allies in an increasingly hostile world. But bringing them aboard also introduced new tensions into our group dynamic. We now had 13 people on a vessel designed for a crew of 8, including 2 traumatized children, a grieving widower, and 5 armed strangers who had been threatening us minutes earlier. Trust was non-existent, resources were stretched thin, and everyone was operating under stress levels that made rational decision-making almost impossible. The leader of the armed group introduced himself as Marcus Thompson, former military police who had been trying to organize survivor communities along the river. His people were experienced fighters, but they had lost their base of operations when infected overran their defensive positions. They had families scattered across several temporary camps, and they were desperate to reunite their people and establish a more secure location. Elena took charge of integrating the new arrivals into our security protocols, while Carlos recalculated our supply requirements based on the increased population. Tommy worked with their mechanic to optimize our engine performance for the additional weight and changing operational requirements. I focused on navigation and strategic planning, trying to figure out how to manage a floating refugee camp while maintaining our mobility and defensive capabilities. That evening, anchored in a remote section of river with armed watches posted around the clock, we held our first group meeting to establish rules and priorities for our expanded community. It was a difficult conversation that revealed fundamental disagreements about survival philosophy. Some people wanted to find a safe location and establish a permanent base. Others preferred to remain mobile and avoid long-term commitments. Everyone agreed that we needed better weapons, more supplies, and reliable intelligence about conditions throughout the river system. Marcus shared information that changed my understanding of the overall situation. According to his contacts, the infection had spread far beyond the initial outbreak zones. Major cities across the country were reporting similar conditions, with government authority breaking down and military units either overwhelmed or gone silent. International communications suggested the crisis was global, though details were scarce and often contradictory. More importantly, he confirmed what I had been suspecting about the infected behavior patterns. They were definitely coordinating activities across wide areas, sharing information through methods that weren't yet understood, and adapting their tactics based on encounters with human survivors. Some groups had even been observed using simple tools and basic weapons, suggesting that the infection didn't completely destroy cognitive function, but rather redirected it toward hunting and survival instincts. The radio traffic that night included more of those coded transmissions, and Marcus recognized some of the patterns. He said they were consistent with military communication protocols, which meant organized survivor groups were maintaining contact across long distances and coordinating their activities. That offered hope for eventual recovery and reconstruction, but it also meant competition for resources and territory would become more intense as different groups established their territorial claims. Elena made an observation that proved prescient. She said our current group was probably close to the maximum size that could be sustained on a single vessel without major modifications to our living and supply arrangements. Taking on more refugees would require difficult choices about resource allocation and space management. But leaving people behind was becoming psychologically harder for everyone involved, creating internal conflicts that could tear our group apart. The children were the hardest part of our new reality. They needed stability, safety, and adult attention that was difficult to provide in our current circumstances. But they also represented hope for the future, evidence that some innocents could survive even the worst human catastrophe. Everyone in our group felt protective toward them, but that protective instinct also made us more vulnerable to manipulation and poor decision-making. Tommy estimated that our fuel supplies would last about 2 more days at current consumption rates, assuming we didn't need to make any high-speed escapes or long detours. After that, we would need to find additional fuel sources or significantly reduce our operational tempo. The problem was that most fuel depots were located near populated areas that were now infected strongholds, making resupply operations extremely dangerous. Marcus suggested that there might be hidden supply caches established by survivor networks, fuel depots that had been secured and defended by organized groups. But accessing those resources would require making contact with unknown groups whose intentions and capabilities were uncertain. We would be trading our current independence for potential access to resources, with no guarantee that the exchange would benefit anyone except the people controlling those supplies. As I prepared for another night watch, I reflected on how much our situation had changed in just 4 days. We had evolved from a commercial cargo operation to a floating refugee community, from following established shipping routes to making survival decisions hour by hour. Our crew had expanded to include strangers who might become allies or enemies, depending on how resources and leadership issues were resolved over the coming days. But we had also learned valuable lessons about cooperation under stress, about the importance of maintaining human connections even when survival required difficult choices. The woman who had chosen to die rather than endanger her children had shown us what courage looked like in impossible circumstances. The armed survivors who had threatened us and then fought alongside us against infected attacks had demonstrated that enemies could become allies when faced with common threats. The coded radio transmissions were becoming more frequent and more complex, suggesting that survivor networks were expanding and developing more sophisticated communication protocols. Someone out there was organizing resistance to the infected threat, coordinating activities across multiple states, maybe even planning large-scale operations to retake lost territory. But those same transmissions also indicated growing tensions between different survivor groups as competition for resources intensified. What I was beginning to understand was that surviving the initial outbreak was only the first challenge. The harder test was maintaining humanity and cooperation, while competing for limited resources in a world where traditional authority structures had collapsed. The infected were dangerous, but they were predictable in their hostility. Other human survivors were potentially more dangerous because their motivations were complex, and their allegiances could shift based on changing circumstances. Over the next 3 days, I would learn that the choice between humanity and survival wasn't a one-time decision. It was something we would face again and again, with stakes that kept getting higher and options that kept getting worse. And sometimes the people trying to help you were more dangerous than the monsters trying to kill you. October 19th dawned with a discovery that changed everything we thought we understood about survival in this new world. Maria, the woman we had rescued along with her children, had been working quietly with our radio equipment during the night watches. She hadn't told anyone about her background, but it turned out she had been a communications specialist with the National Guard before the outbreak. While the rest of us had been treating the strange radio patterns as random interference, she had been decoding them systematically. The static wasn't random at all. It was a coordinated communication network linking survivor communities across hundreds of miles of river system. Groups were sharing information about infected movement patterns, resource locations, safe passage routes, and potential threats from hostile survivor factions. There was an entire shadow economy operating on America's waterways, invisible to anyone who didn't know the codes and frequencies being used. Maria showed me how the transmissions worked, pointing out the patterns that indicated position reports, supply requests, warnings about infected concentrations, and coordination signals for joint operations. The network covered the entire Mississippi River system from Minnesota to Louisiana, with secondary networks on major tributaries like the Ohio and Arkansas rivers. Hundreds of vessels and shore-based communities were maintaining contact despite the breakdown of conventional communication infrastructure. But there was more. The network operated under strict protocols that emphasized resource sharing and mutual assistance. Communities that hoarded supplies or refused to help other survivors were blacklisted and denied access to shared intelligence. Vessels that participated in the network were expected to carry messages, provide emergency assistance, and contribute resources to common defense efforts. It was a new form of civilization emerging from the ruins of the old one. Marcus confirmed what Maria had discovered, adding details from his own experience with organized survivor groups. He said the network had been developing since the second day of the outbreak, when it became clear that government authority was collapsing and individual communities would need to cooperate to survive. Former military personnel, emergency responders, and experienced river workers had taken leadership roles in establishing communication protocols and operational procedures. The question for our group was whether to make contact with the network and request admission. The benefits were obvious: access to real-time intelligence about infected movements, coordination with other vessels for mutual defense, information about secure supply depots and safe harbors. But membership also came with obligations that would limit our independence and require us to share resources that were already stretched thin. Elena argued strongly for joining the network, pointing out that our current isolation was unsustainable and that cooperation with other survivors offered our best chance for long-term survival. Carlos was more cautious, noting that we didn't know enough about the network's leadership or decision-making processes to commit ourselves to following their directions. Tommy worried that larger organizations would be more vulnerable to infiltration by hostile groups or infected individuals who retained enough intelligence to deceive human communities. I made the decision to establish contact, but maintain our independence until we could learn more about how the network operated. Maria worked with our radio equipment to transmit the proper identification codes and request permission to communicate with network coordinators. The response came within an hour, and it included detailed instructions for a face-to-face meeting at a secure location about 20 miles downstream. The meeting site was an abandoned marina that had been converted into a temporary supply depot by network members. As we approached the coordinates, I could see evidence of organized defensive preparations. Concealed observation posts, prepared firing positions, underwater obstacles to prevent unauthorized vessel access. This wasn't a desperate group of refugees improvising survival strategies. This was a military-style operation with professional leadership and coordinated planning. The marina was bustling with activity despite the early morning hour. At least 6 other vessels were moored at the docks, ranging from commercial barges like ours to converted pleasure boats and military patrol craft. People were moving cargo, performing maintenance, and conducting what looked like formal briefings. Everyone was armed, everyone moved with purpose, and everyone seemed to know exactly what they were supposed to be doing. We were met by a woman who introduced herself as Commander Sarah Chen, former Coast Guard officer, who had assumed leadership responsibilities for this section of the river network. She was professional, competent, and clearly experienced in managing complex operations under difficult conditions. But she was also evaluating us carefully, assessing our capabilities, resources, and potential value to the network's overall mission. The briefing she provided was both encouraging and sobering. The network had successfully established secure communication with over 40 survivor communities along the river system, coordinated successful evacuations from infected overrun areas, and maintained supply lines that kept isolated groups from starving or running out of essential materials. They had developed tactics for dealing with infected attacks, established protocols for screening new members, and created a governance structure that balanced individual community autonomy with collective security needs. But the network was also under increasing pressure from multiple threats. Infected behavior was becoming more sophisticated and coordinated, suggesting some form of central intelligence that was learning from each encounter with human survivors. Hostile survivor groups were growing more aggressive in their attempts to seize network resources and territory. Most concerning, there were reports of infected individuals who retained enough human intelligence to infiltrate survivor communities and sabotage defensive preparations from within. Commander Chen explained the network's resource-sharing requirements in detail. Member communities were expected to contribute a percentage of their supplies to common stockpiles, provide personnel for joint operations when requested, and share intelligence about threats and opportunities in their operational areas. In return, they received access to coordinated defense planning, priority assistance during emergencies, and information that could mean the difference between survival and destruction. The decision about joining would be made by consensus among our entire group, but Commander Chen made it clear that the window for membership was limited. The network was reaching the maximum size that could be sustained with current resources, and new admissions were being restricted to groups that could make significant contributions to collective capabilities. Our vessel and cargo capacity made us valuable, but we would need to prove our commitment to network principles before being granted full membership status. Marcus knew several of the network leaders from his previous military service, and their reunion provided insights into how the organization had developed. Former military and emergency response personnel had naturally gravitated toward leadership roles, but the network also included civilians with specialized skills like Maria's communications expertise, river pilots like myself, and technical specialists who could maintain essential equipment under field conditions. Alina was impressed by the network's professionalism and organizational structure, but she also noticed signs of strain that suggested the group was operating near its sustainable limits. Supply shortages were becoming more frequent, personnel were showing signs of stress and fatigue, and there were hints of disagreement among leaders about strategic priorities. The network was successful, but its success was attracting attention from threats that might be beyond its capacity to handle. Tommy spent time examining the marina's defensive preparations and was both impressed and concerned by what he saw. The network had obviously learned from previous attacks and developed sophisticated countermeasures against both infected assaults and hostile human actions. But the resources invested in static defenses suggested they were planning for siege conditions, rather than maintaining the mobility that had been our primary survival advantage. The children were fascinated by the activity around the marina and the presence of other families who had found safety within the network. For the first time since the outbreak, they could play with other kids, eat regular meals, and sleep without the constant fear that had dominated their lives for the past week. Maria was torn between wanting security for her family and recognizing that our current independence offered advantages that would be lost in a larger organization. That afternoon, Commander Chen took me aside for a private conversation that revealed the true stakes involved in our membership decision. The network had been monitoring our activities since we first appeared on their communications channels, tracking our route, evaluating our capabilities, and assessing our potential threat level. They knew about our encounters with infected swimmers, our rescue of Maria's family, and our confrontation with hostile survivors near the damaged marina. More importantly, they had intelligence about infected activities that suggested a coordinated campaign to eliminate survivor communities along the river system. The attacks weren't random predatory behavior. They were strategic operations designed to isolate and destroy organized human resistance. The infected were demonstrating planning capabilities that indicated some form of central command structure, possibly controlled by infected individuals who had retained significant cognitive function. Commander Chen showed me intelligence reports that painted a disturbing picture of infected evolution. Early attacks had been disorganized and largely unsuccessful against prepared defenses, but recent operations showed evidence of reconnaissance, tactical planning, and adaptive learning that suggested the infected were developing military-style capabilities. They were using captured equipment, exploiting human psychological weaknesses, and coordinating multi-stage operations across wide geographic areas. The network's response was to consolidate surviving communities into larger, more defensible positions while maintaining mobile strike forces that could respond to threats and conduct offensive operations against infected strongholds. It was a sound strategy from a military perspective, but it also meant abandoning the independence and flexibility that had kept our group alive through the initial crisis period. Alina and Marcus participated in a tactical planning session that revealed both the network's capabilities and its limitations. They had impressive coordination and communication systems, experienced leadership, and sufficient resources to maintain operations for several more months. But they were also fighting a war of attrition against an enemy that was learning faster than they could adapt, growing stronger, while human survivor communities struggled with resource shortages and internal conflicts. The most disturbing intelligence concerned reports of infected individuals who had retained enough human appearance and behavior to successfully infiltrate survivor communities. These infiltrators could pass casual inspection, participate in group activities, and gain access to sensitive information before revealing their true nature in coordinated attacks that devastated unprepared communities from within. The network had developed screening procedures to identify potential infiltrators, but the process was imperfect and required constant vigilance. That evening, our group held a lengthy discussion about whether to join the network or maintain our independence. The arguments were compelling on both sides. Network membership offered security, resources, and coordination that could significantly improve our chances of long-term survival. But it also meant giving up the autonomy that had allowed us to make quick decisions and avoid threats that had destroyed larger, less flexible groups. Maria was strongly in favor of joining, pointing out that her children needed the stability and security that only a larger community could provide. Marcus saw the value of coordinating with other military personnel who shared his understanding of tactical operations and strategic planning. Alina appreciated the network's professionalism and organizational structure, which offered opportunities to contribute her skills more effectively than our current improvised arrangements. Carlos was more skeptical, arguing that larger organizations were inherently more vulnerable to catastrophic failures, and that our current mobility offered advantages that would be difficult to maintain within the network's operational structure. Tommy worried about losing control over our vessel and equipment, pointing out that network protocols might require us to accept missions that put La Esperanza at unnecessary risk. The children just wanted to stay somewhere safe, but they didn't fully understand the implications of the choice we were making. I found myself caught between competing priorities that had no clear resolution. My responsibility to protect my crew argued for maintaining independence and avoiding commitments that might compromise our survival. But my growing understanding of the threats we faced suggested that isolated groups were increasingly vulnerable to coordinated attacks that could overwhelm individual defensive capabilities. The decision became more urgent when Commander Chen informed us that the network had intelligence about a major infected operation planned for our section of the river. Reconnaissance reports indicated that infected forces were massing for coordinated attacks on several survivor communities simultaneously, using tactics that suggested central planning and sophisticated understanding of human defensive strategies. Independent vessels like ours would be priority targets because of their mobility and resource value. The network was offering immediate protection and integration into their defensive plans, but the offer had a time limit. If we chose to remain independent, we would be on our own when the attacks began, with no guarantee that network forces would be available to provide assistance if our situation became desperate. It was essentially an ultimatum disguised as an offer of cooperation. That night, anchored within the marina's defensive perimeter but not yet committed to network membership, I reflected on how quickly our situation had evolved. We had gone from commercial freight haulers to refugees to potential members of an organized resistance movement, all within the span of 6 days. Each transition had required abandoning assumptions and adapting to new realities that would have been unimaginable just a week earlier. The radio traffic that night included urgent communications about infected movements that confirmed the network's intelligence reports. Multiple communities were reporting reconnaissance activity by infected individuals who showed unusual interest in defensive preparations and resource stockpiles. Coordinated probing attacks were testing response capabilities and identifying weaknesses that could be exploited in larger operations. But there were also disturbing reports about conflicts between different survivor networks, competition for territory and resources that was escalating into open warfare between human communities. The breakdown of central authority had created a vacuum that multiple groups were trying to fill, and cooperation was giving way to conquest as resources became scarcer and threats multiplied. Commander Chen made one final argument for network membership that proved decisive. She revealed that the network had located secure fuel depots and supply caches that could extend our operational capabilities for months rather than days. But access to those resources required full membership and participation in network operations, including acceptance of missions that supported collective security rather than individual survival priorities. Our fuel situation had become critical during the extended negotiations and defensive preparations. Carlos estimated that we had maybe 36 hours of operational time remaining at current consumption levels, and finding additional fuel outside the network's controlled supply chain would require taking enormous risks in infected-controlled territory. We were facing the choice between accepting network membership or running out of fuel in hostile waters, with 13 people depending on our vessel for survival. The morning of October 20th would bring our final decision about independence versus security, about maintaining control over our own destiny versus accepting the protection and obligations that came with membership in a larger community. But it would also bring something none of us had anticipated, something that would test everything we had learned about survival, cooperation, and what it means to remain human when the world around you has become monstrous. Because the infected weren't the only ones who had learned that sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy was to make them think you were their friend. The morning of October 21st began with what sounded like distant thunder, but the sky was clear, and the weather reports had predicted calm conditions. Commander Chen was on the radio immediately, coordinating with observation posts and gathering intelligence about the source of the sounds. Within minutes, we had our answer. The infected had begun their coordinated assault on the river network, and the thunder was the sound of explosions from communities under attack 15 miles upstream. The network's early warning system had detected the approach of infected forces during the night, but the scale of the operation exceeded all previous intelligence estimates. Instead of isolated attacks on individual communities, this was a synchronized offensive involving thousands of infected individuals moving in coordinated formations. They were using captured boats, improvised weapons, and tactical coordination that demonstrated planning capabilities no one had believed possible. Commander Chen immediately implemented emergency protocols that had been developed for exactly this scenario. All network vessels were ordered to defensive positions, supply caches were secured or evacuated, and mobile strike forces were deployed to provide assistance to communities under direct attack. The marina transformed from a supply depot into a military command center, with personnel moving with the precision of a well-trained unit, responding to a crisis they had prepared for but hoped would never come. Our group found ourselves swept up in preparations we didn't fully understand, assigned roles in defensive plans we had never agreed to support. Elena was integrated into a tactical planning team, coordinating vessel movements. Marcus was assigned to a quick reaction force, preparing to deploy upstream to assist besieged communities. Tommy was ordered to help prepare our engines for high-speed operations that might be required at any moment. But I was beginning to notice details that didn't fit the narrative of professional crisis response. The network's communications were too smooth, their preparations too well coordinated, their intelligence about infected capabilities too accurate. It was as if they had known exactly what to expect and when to expect it. Either they had sources of information they hadn't shared with us, or this crisis was less spontaneous than it appeared. Maria was monitoring network communications when she discovered something that changed everything. Hidden in the routine traffic were coded signals that shouldn't have existed, coordination messages between network leadership and unknown contacts using encryption protocols that suggested cooperation rather than conflict with the forces attacking survivor communities. The network wasn't just responding to the infected assault, they were participating in it. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The professional organization we had been considering joining, the coordinated resistance that had offered hope for rebuilding civilization, was actually collaborating with the infected forces that were systematically destroying independent survivor communities. Commander Chen and her people weren't military professionals trying to save humanity. They were something far more dangerous. I gathered my crew immediately and explained what Maria had discovered. The network was using the infected attacks to eliminate independent survivor groups and force the remaining communities to join their organization or be destroyed. They were creating the crisis they claimed to be solving, manipulating desperate people into surrendering their independence in exchange for protection from threats the network itself was directing. Alina's military training allowed her to recognize the tactical patterns that confirmed our suspicions. The network's defensive preparations were designed to channel attacking forces toward specific targets while protecting network assets. Their intelligence about infected movements was too detailed and too accurate to have come from reconnaissance alone. Most telling, their response procedures assumed they would know exactly where and when attacks would occur. Marcus had noticed similar inconsistencies in the behavior of network leadership. Personnel were being positioned based on advanced knowledge of events that hadn't happened yet. Resources were being allocated according to priorities that didn't match the stated objectives, and critical decisions were being made by people who claimed to be responding to intelligence, but were clearly implementing predetermined plans. Tommy's engineering perspective revealed another layer of deception. The network's vessels and equipment showed modifications that were specifically designed for coordinating with infected forces rather than defending against them. Communication systems had been altered to broadcast on frequencies that attracted infected attention. Weapons had been modified with non-lethal ammunition that would incapacitate rather than kill infected individuals. And fuel systems had been rigged to disable vessels remotely if crew members refused to follow network orders. The children sensed the tension among the adults, but didn't understand the implications of what we were discovering. Maria was torn between protecting her family and recognizing that the network represented a threat to everyone she cared about. Carlos was calculating escape routes and fuel consumption, while Elena reviewed tactical options for getting our group away from the marina before our discovery of the network's true nature was detected. Commander Chen approached me around noon with an ultimatum that confirmed our worst suspicions. She said the infected attacks had made independent operation impossible, and that all vessels in the area were being integrated into network command structure immediately. Refusal to comply would be treated as desertion during wartime, with appropriate consequences for anyone who endangered network operations by pursuing selfish individual interests. But she made a critical mistake in her presentation that revealed the scope of the deception. She referred to infected movements and tactical decisions, using terminology that indicated direct communication with infected leadership, rather than intelligence gathered through observation. She knew too much about infected plans and capabilities to have learned it through conventional reconnaissance methods. I realized that the network wasn't just collaborating with infected forces, they were directing them. The breakdown of civilization hadn't been caused by random outbreak and spread of infection. It had been orchestrated by people who saw an opportunity to rebuild society according to their own vision. The infected weren't mindless monsters driven by biological imperatives. They were weapons being used by human beings who had decided that existing civilization needed to be destroyed and replaced. The most horrifying revelation was understanding what the network's long-term goals actually involved. They weren't trying to save humanity from the infected threat. They were using the infected to eliminate resistance to their authority and create a new social order with themselves in absolute control. Survivor communities that joined the network would eventually be absorbed completely. losing all independence and becoming part of a totalitarian system that used the threat of infected attack to maintain obedience. Alina had been monitoring network security protocols and discovered that our group was already marked for special attention. Our skills and resources made us valuable, but our independence and questioning attitude made us potentially dangerous to network authority. We were being positioned for forced integration that would separate our group, reassign our personnel to different units, and eliminate any possibility of coordinated resistance to network control. I made the decision to escape immediately, before the network could implement whatever plans they had developed for dealing with uncooperative recruits. But getting 13 people off a heavily defended facility without alerting security forces would require coordination and deception that pushed our capabilities to the limit. We would have one chance to get away, and failure would probably mean death or worse for everyone in our group. Tommy had been quietly sabotaging network communication equipment while pretending to assist with maintenance operations. His work created selective disruptions that would prevent coordination of pursuit efforts while maintaining enough functionality to avoid immediate detection. Alina used her tactical knowledge to identify blind spots in the marina's security coverage and plan movement routes that avoided observation posts. Carlos prepared La Esperanza for immediate departure while maintaining the appearance of routine maintenance activities. Maria's communications expertise became crucial for implementing our escape plan. She created false radio traffic that suggested our group was participating in network operations, while actually covering our preparation for departure. Her understanding of network protocols allowed her to generate realistic status reports that would delay detection of our escape until we were already clear of the immediate area. Marcus faced the most difficult choice of anyone in our group. Several of his former military colleagues were serving in network leadership positions, people he had trusted and respected for years. Learning that they were participating in the systematic destruction of survivor communities challenged everything he believed about honor, duty, and the responsibility of military personnel to protect civilian populations. The escape itself required perfect timing and coordination among people who had been working together for only a few days. We had to move 13 people and essential supplies from the marina to our vessel without alerting guards who were specifically watching for signs of unauthorized departure. Every step had to appear routine while actually implementing a complex plan that depended on multiple elements working exactly as intended. Alina created a diversion by reporting suspicious activity near the marina's fuel depot, drawing security attention away from our departure point. Tommy activated the communication disruptions he had prepared, creating confusion about the source of various alarms and status reports. Maria maintained false radio traffic that suggested our group was responding to emergency assignments rather than attempting to escape. The most dangerous moment came when we were starting our engines and preparing to leave the marina. Commander Chen appeared on the dock and demanded to know why we were departing without proper authorization. I told her we had received emergency orders to investigate reported infected activity downstream, using network protocols that Maria had taught me to create believable false instructions. But Chen wasn't fooled by our deception. She knew we had discovered the network's true nature, and she was prepared to use force to prevent our departure. Armed personnel began moving toward our vessel while she continued talking, buying time for her people to get into position for an assault that would overwhelm our defensive capabilities and capture our group before we could escape. That's when the infected arrived. The coordinated attack that the network had been orchestrating finally reached the marina itself, but something had gone wrong with their control mechanisms. Instead of following predetermined plans that would preserve network assets while destroying independent survivors, the infected forces were attacking everything in sight. The careful coordination between network leadership and infected commanders had broken down, leaving everyone in the area vulnerable to assault by thousands of infected individuals who were no longer following anyone's orders. The marina erupted into chaos as network personnel found themselves fighting for their lives against the same forces they had been trying to control. Commander Chen and her people were discovering that partnerships with infected leadership were inherently unstable, that the infected retained enough human intelligence to develop their own agenda that didn't necessarily align with network objectives. I used the confusion to guide La Esperanza away from the marina, while network forces were distracted by their battle for survival. The infected attack had eliminated the immediate threat from Chen's people, but it had also created a much larger danger as thousands of infected individuals swarmed through the area with no coordination or restraint. Our escape route took us through waters filled with infected swimmers, abandoned vessels, and floating debris from communities that had been overrun during the morning attacks. Every mile of river presented new challenges as we navigated around obstacles, while avoiding contact with infected forces that were spreading throughout the area without direction or purpose. Alina coordinated our defensive efforts as infected individuals attempted to board our vessel, using lessons learned from previous encounters to maintain our mobility while repelling boarders. Marcus applied his tactical knowledge to predict infected movement patterns and identify safe passages through areas of heavy activity. Tommy kept our engines running at maximum efficiency, while Carlos navigated around obstacles that could disable our vessel if we weren't careful. The radio traffic had become a mixture of emergency calls from surviving communities, coordination attempts by network remnants, and something new that none of us had heard before: direct communication between infected individuals using human language and complex tactical terminology that indicated they had retained far more cognitive function than anyone had realized. Maria was monitoring these transmissions when she made a discovery that explained everything we had witnessed over the past week. The infected weren't victims of a disease or biological weapon that had destroyed their humanity while leaving basic motor functions intact. They were humans who had undergone a controlled transformation that enhanced certain capabilities while redirecting psychological priorities toward collective survival and expansion. The infection was reversible under certain conditions, which explained how network leadership had been able to coordinate with infected forces without becoming infected themselves. But the reversal process required resources and technology that were carefully controlled by the people who had created the outbreak in the first place. The entire crisis had been manufactured to create a new form of society with strict hierarchical control and no possibility of individual resistance. We spent the afternoon navigating through the aftermath of the morning's coordinated attacks, passing communities that had been completely overrun and others that were still fighting desperate defensive actions against infected forces that no longer showed any tactical coordination. The breakdown of communication between network leadership and infected commanders had created a chaotic situation where everyone was fighting everyone else with no clear objectives or strategic planning. The children were terrified by the sounds of battle and destruction that surrounded us, but they were also beginning to understand that the nice people at the marina hadn't actually been trying to help them. Maria did her best to explain that sometimes bad people pretended to be good people to trick others into doing what they wanted, a lesson that was unfortunately becoming very relevant to our current situation. By evening, we had cleared the immediate combat zone and found temporary refuge in a remote section of river that offered good visibility and multiple escape routes. Our fuel situation remained critical, but Tommy had been working on modifications that improved our efficiency, while Carlos had identified potential supply sources that might be accessible without exposing our group to unnecessary risks. Alina estimated that the network had probably lost effective control over most of their infected allies, meaning the immediate threat from coordinated attacks was reduced, but the danger from random infected activity had increased significantly. Marcus pointed out that other survivor communities would now be aware of the network's betrayal, creating opportunities for forming new alliances based on genuine cooperation rather than deception and manipulation. The radio traffic that night included communications from survivor groups throughout the river system who had discovered evidence of network collaboration with infected forces. The betrayal hadn't been limited to our area. It had been part of a systematic campaign to eliminate independent communities across hundreds of miles of waterway. But the loss of control over infected forces had derailed those plans and created opportunities for survivors to reestablish communication and coordination. I realized that our escape from the marina had been successful not just because of our planning and execution, but because we had maintained the independence and flexibility that allowed us to recognize threats and respond quickly when circumstances changed. The network's hierarchical structure and predetermined procedures had made them vulnerable to catastrophic failure when their careful plans encountered unexpected developments. Over the following days, we would help establish new communication networks based on voluntary cooperation rather than forced integration. We would share intelligence about infected behavior and network activities with other independent survivor groups. We would participate in joint operations that respected individual community autonomy while providing mutual assistance against common threats. The river that had been my highway, workplace, and sanctuary for most of my adult life remained dangerous and unpredictable, but it was also flowing with new possibilities for cooperation and reconstruction that respected human dignity and individual choice. My grandfather's lessons about reading water and navigating dangerous currents had proven valuable in ways he never could have imagined. La Esperanza continued to serve as both our home and our contribution to the emerging network of genuine survivor communities. We carried supplies, delivered messages, provided assistance during emergencies, and maintained our independence while participating in collective security efforts. The children found stability in our floating community while learning skills that would help them survive and thrive in whatever world emerged from the current crisis. 7 days had taught me that survival isn't just about having the right equipment or knowing the right techniques. It's about maintaining the flexibility to adapt when circumstances change, the wisdom to distinguish between genuine cooperation and manipulative control, and the courage to make difficult choices that preserve human dignity even when easier options are available. The Mississippi River keeps flowing regardless of what humans do to each other, carrying away the debris of our conflicts while providing the foundation for whatever comes next. Those of us who survived learned to flow with that current when necessary, but also to navigate against it when our values and the safety of people we care about require us to choose the harder path.